Today's video will be a little different from my previous vids. What I want to do today is to review my investments with and in financial institutions that are owned and operated by blacks, right? And the results have been decidedly mixed, but we'll get into it. Hi, I'm John McNeil, and this is the Invest Strong Network. Welcome. Okay, so for about 25 years or so, I've been investing in various mutual funds and shares of some black-owned banks. And what I wanted to do was to start off with my first really significant investment in a black-owned mutual fund. And that goes back to the late 1990s when I invested about $10,000 or so in the shares of the Lou Holland Growth Fund. Now, Louis Holland, former football player, Chicago Bears, and he would make frequent appearances on that PBS program, Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser. All right. So I perused his funds, looked at the prospectus, was impressed, dropped about 10 grand in it back in 1999. And the Lou Holland Growth Fund performed very well for the time that I owned it. Now, what happened was Mr. Holland himself fell ill, Alzheimer's disease, in the middle 2000s. Tragically passed away in 2016. And the mutual fund company that he controlled actually liquidated a year later. Now, the fund survives actually in the form of the American Beacon Bridgeway Large Capital Growth Fund, no longer black owned or managed, right? Now, if you take a composite of the total return from the predecessor management until the contemporary management, the fund has actually delivered about 8.5% annual since I purchased the shares back in the late 1990s. So we'll chalk that up to as a win. All right. Now, there are not a lot of black-owned mutual fund houses out there, but there are a couple that I think really deserve your attention. The first is Brown Capital Management, website browncapital.com. Now, the company is owned and operated by this guy, Eddie Brown, another frequent guest on Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser, and it's based out of Baltimore. Now, in perusing the funds that are managed by Mr. Brown and his team, you will notice a very impressive record of long-term returns, right? And the company itself dates back to 1983, so you have a pretty substantial body of evidence to base your reviews on. In reviewing and analyzing their funds, I was very impressed with the performance of their funds long term, right? So I would definitely suggest anyone out there who see this vid, give Brown Capital some thought, right? All of the funds are actively managed. Expense ratios, around 1% or so a year, depending upon the fund and what it invests in. Not outrageous, right around the midsection there for an actively managed mutual fund. The telephone number there is 877-892-4226. All right. The second mutual fund house, black owned and managed, that I would recommend is Ariel Investments. That website is www.ariel, that's ARIEL, investments with an S.com. Based out of Milwaukee, they also have a very substantial record of achievement. right? The company is owned and managed by John Rogers. He's yet another guest on Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser. And you can feel good about investing in one of the Ariel investment mutual funds, right? And that telephone number is 1-800-292-7435. Now, I do want to add this. In the late 2000s, I invested in the Now Africa Fund. So I invested roughly $2,500. The fund was managed by this guy, Larry Saruma, based out of New York, and he would invest in companies in the motherland, right? Fund did not do well from day one. And in fact, it struggled all the way until 2018. Mr. Saruma felt that the markets in the motherland were just not liquid enough. There was a lot of geopolitical risk. The currency translation was bad. It's just the markets were just not really mature for a mutual fund for American investors at that time. So he actually closed the fund down, refunded everyone their money, right? And basically just folded shop. May come back at another time. Let's hope, when the markets are a bit more mature. But as of right now, the Nile Africa Fund certainly can't chalk it up as a winner, right? All right. Now, where I live in Houston, there are a couple of Black-owned banks in the Houston area, but not near where I live. So I have not really utilized a Black-owned bank for anything of substance. However, I have owned shares in two publicly traded Black-owned banks. Right. The first is Carver Bank, based out of New York. That's ticker symbol CARV. Now, I purchased the shares of Carver back in the early 2000s. And in fact, the shares did very, very well for the first few years. But the shares of Carver Bank were absolutely walloped by the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And they sent the shares of the company, which was heavily based in mortgages and minority communities and whatnot. It sent the shares, careening into the abyss of penny stockdom, where they remain even until today. Right. Okay. Now, the second bank, a little unusual, Banco Popular out of San Juan, Puerto Rico. Now, I know what you might be saying. Wait a minute. You said Black-owned banks. Well, Banco Popular, it has a large Afro-Hispanic component to it. And in fact, the ownership arrangement in Puerto Rico has a very significant Afro-Hispanic contingency to it. And in fact, most of the branches in the U.S., the mainland, in New York, Miami, and other places, they actually service the Afro-Hispanic community and other minority communities. So for that sake, we'll chalk it up as a Black-owned bank, right? Now, I acquired the shares in the middle 2000s, and again, just like Carver, did very well for the first few years. But just like Carver, they were absolutely walloped by the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Now, the shares have recovered somewhat, and that's good, but they're nowhere near the previous highs. And that's kind of par for the course for most of the financial institutions out there of any stripe. Some of them have not and will never return to the highs previous to the great financial crisis, right? But Banco Popular is servicing a growing Hispanic community, a growing Afro-Hispanic community. And I think that going forward, the shares will be just fine, right? And would make a pretty good investment for anyone interested in investing in those communities. right? All right. So these have been my experiences, and I hope that you've been able to take something from it and perhaps utilize in your investment portfolio going forward. All right. Thank you much.